Good evening. So I'm very, very happy and honored to introduce Denis Hirson on behalf of Professor Judith Balsot and the European Graduate School. Denis Hirson is a South African poet, writer, and essayist living in Paris. And as said, he's our invited poet of this year. And he's published a lot of books, among them White Scars, I Remember King Kong, and Gardening in the Dark. That are books that are all connected by his experience of being a South African, grew up in South Africa, and then migrated in Europe with a series of major consequences, also in terms of the structure of his own writing and his poetry. So Denis is going to read from several books. I also see here some very interesting instruments. So I'm really, we want to hear what's going on here. So I'll let him start the reading straight away. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you to Alessandro. Thank you to the EGS for inviting me here. Thank you to Wolfgang Schirmacher for being here and for having invented this magical place, which I have not yet discovered the full coordinates of, but which is quite extraordinary to be reading not only in this space, but with the mountains through the window. It's not at all the same thing as reading in a cellar in Paris on a winter's evening. And thank you to Judith Balsot also for having spotted me and invited me. It was a great surprise to get an email from her all of a sudden and to find myself invited to a place like this. Now I'm not going to speak like this anymore for a while. I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. Johannesburg, 1964. A storm cloud hovers around me. It rumbles and darkens, but it brings no rain. My father is in prison. For 3 years I do not see him again, and for 6 more he stays there. This is a secret. I believe many people are aware of it, yet I share it with no one. And all around me it swells and bruises the air. I write a poem. At our school there is a man who takes the register from class to class with its columns of ticks for those who are present. Yet the man in washed out blue overalls and worn tackies is entirely absent, like most black people, from our lives. I write about him entering words and their sound. It is the gravity of absence that holds me to the ground. Through school and university, I write and read chaotically, staying close to the red heart of my own emotion. Too close. A friend shocks me with his comment, "When I read a poem, I want to read about me." My father is released from prison at the end of 1973. He comes walking down our garden path. I hug him, but anger gags my love for him and will not set me free. We must leave the country. I buy a young maple tree and bring it as a gift to the school where I've been teaching. But for some reason, I leave it too long in my hot car so that the leaves droop, while the air in there is saturated with the sweet green acids of chlorophyll. I am that tree, overheated and unplanted, stooping for earth and water, waiting for the winds of chance to blow freshness through me. early 1980s. I sit down to write about South Africa. I live at the end of a cobbled, narrow cul-de-sac in the 11th arrondissement of Paris, past a boilermakers, several other small factories and offices, low blocks of flats, and a creche run by Scientologists. The first flat I have ever truly been able to call my own. Opposite my second floor window there is a square with a dull oblong block of flats to the left, and behind the sandpit at the far end a prefab which serves as a club for old age pensioners. The square is lined with 10 acacia trees. Its sand reflects the light and is pale ochre in the early morning, turning rough and glittery as sandpaper in the middle of a clear summer's day, with a diluted violet stain across it as the sun goes down. Not much happens in the square. Sometimes unemployed men come and play pétanque, and I hear the clicking of the metal balls, or a man shouting out, "Joli, joli," in appreciation of a fine shot. Once on a hot day, the children of the concierge stand at the edge of the sandpit, count loudly to 3, flex their knees, and dive in. The square is like a page seamed to the page I write on. On arriving in France, I had pushed South Africa away from me as hard as I was able to, wanting a new space for myself, a new language, a new skin. But now, after 6 or 7 years, I want it back. It won't come. My words are all restless with anger or static as anecdotes, memories of memories, dry as scars, nothing I didn't know before I started. My wastepaper basket fills with crumpled pages. I become aware of a man who is out in the square every day. He sits on one of the 3 benches between the trees opposite the block of flats. Behind him rises a great solid wall of bone-white stone. His face is closed. The heavy, unshaven features seem to be stuck onto it. His clothes are toneless as cardboard or sacking, and he wears military boots. He sits with all his weight against the bench, hardly bending to its form, arms folded in violent immobility. Sometimes other people come up and talk to him. He even joins in with the men playing pétanque, but when they leave, he returns to his bench and possesses it with his bulk, and the whole square seems to cave in under him. In the autumn, when the acacias lose their leaves and the light dulls on the sand, he is still there. His form is tight as a mortar, ready to hurl itself. He has gathered the square like a greatcoat around him and turned it into his encampment. In the wake of his utter isolation, I imagine other men, mute and empty, massing to join ranks with him. Upon the sand opposite my blank page, an unseen threat gathers around this man, his presence swollen with news of rising unemployment and increasing support for the blunt, cocksure stance of the French extreme right. With the sharp grey glaze of winter at the window, I sit for longer hours at the page. Eventually, some words survive my continual attempts to scratch them out. They pack themselves densely as refugees with nothing of their own in the world but each other, in paragraphs each surrounded like verses by a blank breathing space, in passages not longer than a page or 2. Across these pages, some fragmented semblance of Johannesburg begins to appear. The city has been refracted by 7 years of distance. It is a city of memory, and I want it to sing. With everything I have learnt from Isaac Babel and Bruno Schultz, Henri Michaud and Michael Ondaki, Dylan Thomas, Pablo Neruda, and anyone else who knows how to rub a rock and its shadow together to get a song. With my best breath, I want to lever it out of the heavy place where it has sunk into me. I want to be arrested so that I can read the Bible. Everyone is being arrested or receiving special visits in the middle of a dream, or hearing trees shake when there isn't even a breeze. One might at least expect to walk outside in the morning and find the rose bushes with their toes up in the air, freshly dug holes in the ground around them where someone was prospecting for banned books. But ever since they came for my father, our house has been unfairly ignored. Once again, I begin the book of Genesis. Once again, the light is divided from darkness. The waters under the heavens are gathered together unto one place, and the dry land appears. But there is always some interruption. I have to drive off to the Greek cafe to buy some cat food, or fetch my brother from judo, or the newspaper lands on the lawn, covered in blood. I unfold it, and out fall foaming dog bites and well-sharpened bicycle spokes, hose pipes fixed from gas taps to lovers' mouths, black widow spiders, boxing gloves, and bars of soap. Out fall laws and words of the dead. By the middle of the night, the grass is still red. But the house is so quiet. My brother and sister have sunk into sleep. My mother is learning about nerve messages and electricity. Nyanga, the schizophrenic cat, is up a tree, stalking moonlight. The house is so quiet, standing in its garden in the night. There are only the termites picking at its foundations, and then my mother running a bath. Suddenly there's a rash of doors slamming all around our block, car doors, and I think to myself, this is it, they are coming to take me away. I hold my breath, waiting for our gate to squeak open, wondering how I'm going to get at my toothbrush now that my mother has locked herself into the bathroom. But then the cars grunt and rumble off. There must have been another meeting at the crippled school across the road. I want to be arrested so that I can read the Bible right through from the beginning to the end. I've had enough of this suspension in the cool jasmine air, neither here nor there, the blacks and the others surrounding me with their ancestral bones and their battles, staking out a birthright which is not mine. I want 4 parked walls and a little lock in the door, steps going in the other direction down the corridor, and then, at last, I will open the book and set out across its fine beaten, burning words. I will learn their ancient shivering heat, the way they heap and flex and infinitely divide. Facet by facet, I will follow the contours of their questioning. At night, I will watch the darkness cover them letter by letter, claiming their white territory until they each subside and go dumb. And in their silent company, I will lay myself down, flat and faithful as a bookmark, waiting for daylight to deliver the next sentence. A man stood out on our porch one night, alone as far as we could see. We recognized him immediately and let him in, along with a small band of rose beetles that went catapulting against the lights. He sat at the edge of the Morris settee and dipped Romany creams into his tea, smiling the tight smile of the fugitive who will give himself to no one in his flight. My mother aimed questions at him, sharp with the blade of her anxiety, and he explained to her why they had let him out so early, his mother's dogged efforts and the French embassy. I half listened, only wanting him to go away. In the charcoal suit that was not quite the right size, with his accent and his bad skin and his pudgy hands. Let the night take him back, the wide black night salty with stars, where my father sat in the same prison he'd just been freed from. Baruch's fine, he told us, full of fight. The real news, though, was that if one prisoner could make it home, then why not another any day now across the border post of absence, through the no man's land of loss, washing his skin of the smell of the dead, bringing his love home to us like a loaf of bread. But when the man finally got up to leave, my father was even further away than before, the house twice as empty, while the rose beetles went on tirelessly flying, unwinding the haywire coil of their want against the heat of the lights. In the Witwatersrand, mighty chestnut trees raise the white wick of their blossom, tier upon tier into the late May sky, while down below their trunks become goalposts for a dusty milling host of boys. A few paces away, in the chestnut's wide and pleasant shade, my son stands at a park bench, wipes an eye and raises his forearm, displaying to an older friend his first true red glazed gash, gained after skidding into a tackle. The friend gives it a glance, then rolls a trouser leg to the knee, displaying his own pedigree of welt and scar, truth notched in their skin for all to see. No wounds, no history. The man comes walking, tall and solemn and slow. One of his hands bends into a fist, an old fist, tight with stamina and ash. He raises it before the crowd, which presses in on him and takes possession of his name. The man's suit has an executive cut and sheen for the TV cameras that scatter his image across millions of screens. But the set of his face is answerable to no one, more resolute as he comes closer and more remote. He advances warily, restraining with his pace the entire procession of loyal aides and gunslingers, high priests, kith and kin, praise singers and hangers-on. It's been 27 years of bootsteps and breaking stones. Out of time with all the elation, he is still alone. There are only a few yards to go now. The ground widens under his feet. It is February the 11th, 1990. History waits for him like a big smart car, and he gets in. The crowd packs the rear view mirror and windscreen. The ignition is switched on. The man is back in the land of the living. His myth is in contact with oxygen. One long ocean away, I watch it happen. Wind spreads the chiffon curtains in our flat. The zinc roofs of Paris are lacquered with rain. I switch channels following the man to the car again and again. And then he is gone and another man comes walking. And he is my newly freed father crossing the garden of absence to meet me. Above us, a single butcher bird on a telephone wire. The sun is hot, but I can't feel its fire. I am against him, and the ground under our feet changes to water. We belong to no single place. Ours is the history of those who cross over. And at the docks to wave us goodbye, there are only a few acquaintances, and no doubt a few cops. Car tires stick like Velcro to the wet streets outside. Windows flicker with the foggy light of TV. One more news program, and Mandela comes walking, behind him the unsealed door of an entire country. I pick up the phone and call South Africa. Hello, I say, and the echo of my voice returns to me from under the sea. Hello, a friend answers. Are you all right? I squeeze the receiver so hard my hand is white. When a vacuum is broken, air rushes in. I'm at the far end of the world, listening to the wind. It is the 11th of February 1990 and Nelson Mandela walks from prison. I don't even want to watch this on television, though I do. My life is now in France with the woman I love, I say, without a clue as to how all this will hit me, following that solitary man's footsteps as they cross to the new side of history. Is it not an optical illusion that when Mandela enters his car and is driven from prison, he alone brings the entire country back from behind bars? Well, the mind works in terms of the illusions it chooses. And as I sit bolted to an old leather armchair before the TV, while yet another station shows Mandela walking free, it is my father I find walking towards me, and suddenly now I can receive him. This is not only our own knotted his story, nor are Mandela's footsteps his alone. This is the moment when everyone is multiplied by the fertile whole number of hope. I write, and in my writing, I'm still in South Africa. I read and read whatever was written there, catching up on the place where I once saw far more than I allowed myself to see. Do you remember, my 20-year-old daughter asks me today, Papa, do you remember that evening we went to the circus and a prostitute walked out from between the trees almost naked with stars glued to her nipples? Quite impressed with her, weren't you? Yes, I remember. A woman with oiled ebony thighs, eyelids caked with gold glitter, 13 years ago, Bois de Boulogne. I'd hoped my daughter had not seen a thing. Might as well hope that the blackbird won't sing. And in the grey days of apartheid under the pulsing sun, I saw what was going on and was infected by it, went half mute, half refusing the pill of polite white complicity, and would not name the naked truth that walked between the trees. Two poems that are not by me. The one I want to read, here we are. By Wally Mongani Saroti, for Don M. Band. 1974. It is a dry, white season. Dark leaves don't last, their brief lives dry out, and with a broken heart they dive down gently, headed for the earth, not even bleeding. It is a dry, white season, brother, only the trees know the pain as they still stand erect, dry like steel, their branches dry like wire. Indeed, it is a dry, white season, but seasons come to pass. In Detention by Chris van Wyk, 1979. He fell from the 9th floor. He hanged himself. He slipped on a piece of soap while washing. He hanged himself. He slipped on a piece of soap while washing. He fell from the 9th floor. He hanged himself while washing. He slipped from the 9th floor. He hung from the 9th floor. He slipped on the 9th floor while washing. He fell from a piece of soap while slipping. He hung from the 9th floor. He washed from the 9th floor while slipping. He hung from a piece of soap while washing. He fell from the 9th floor. He hanged himself. He slipped on a piece of soap while washing. He hanged himself. He slipped on a piece of soap while washing. He fell from the 9th floor. He hanged himself while washing. He slipped from the 9th floor. He hung from the 9th floor. He slipped on the 9th floor while washing. He fell from a piece of soap while slipping. He hung from the 9th floor. He washed from the 9th floor while slipping. He hung from a piece of soap while washing. Imagine you are in an aeroplane at daybreak. You have just woken up to an announcement by the pilot that the long flight will be over in a few minutes. A city tilts towards you as the plane approaches. You catch a glimpse of street lamps, cars silently torching the soft grey air, a few yellow windows in the massed darkness of buildings. You are filled with the presence of this place as it stirs from the intimacy of the night. Now imagine that what you are looking at is not a city of the present, but a city of the past, your past, a place you have not lived in for decades, in which you are returning to as if it continued to be all it had ever been before you left. The lights you see are your own glittering, floating memories stretching across the years, some of them highly personal, others shared with neighbors, schoolmates, people you might never have even met, but who once lived in the same place at the same time as you did. These memories rise into focus across the foggy gap of absence. Together they trace the map of a city that shines more and more compellingly in your mind, closer than a jeweled runway below an airplane as it lands. This is the experience I had not so long ago, triggered by a book I read. The memories that kept coming back to me with increasing insistence were mainly of South Africa when I was growing up there in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. The book, however, made no mention of this country at all. It was called Je me souviens, I remember, by Georges Perec, and contained 480 brief numbered entries, most of them connected with a 15-year period after 1946. This was the year when Perec came back to Paris at the age of 10, having spent 3 years in the free zone to avoid capture by the Nazis. Je me souviens is in many ways a celebration of the return to normality in the city. It is filled with references to jazz and cinema, fashion, sport, radio programs and bistros, but it is also a book which, on closer inspection, pays a price for this celebration. Though concerned with memory, it barely touches on the Second World War, during which Perec lost most of his immediate family. His father died in uniform 1 week before the Franco-German armistice. His mother did not survive Auschwitz. In other words, Je me souviens is also, in ways that intimately concern its author, a book of forgetting. The tension between remembering and forgetting, between unmentionable personal loss and relief at the buoyancy of the post-war years, is perhaps part of what drew me to this book. I suspect, though, that beyond the actual content, it was the structure of Je me souviens that triggered my own memories. Here was a way of setting down in brief, pointillist fashion the details of a gone world, creating a pattern that seemed to reflect the syntax of memory itself. The sequence of Perec's notation is unpredictable, elliptical, pursuing a divergent series of paths, zigzagging between different subjects, time periods, widening in scope by way of invisible association. Remembering is an activity that takes place from several angles at once, the mind constantly shifting perspective. It also involves a complementary tendency to focus on individual details, sometimes of the most banal and forgettable variety, but which turn out to be keyholes through which entire landscapes can be glimpsed. Je me souviens is made up of both these aspects simultaneously. Perec borrowed this method from the American Joe Brainard, who in the early 1970s created a frank, capricious, and uproariously funny autobiographical mosaic of his brief recollections, constantly returning to his central theme, colorfully explicit male sexual encounters. If Brainard was flamboyantly transgressing the taboo surrounding homosexuality, Perrick buried his own identity, which he writes of powerfully elsewhere, behind a far less personal set of elements, a collective inventory of mental souvenirs. His was an utterly discreet, tempered exercise, as befitted not only his purpose, but also the highly codified relations and protective pudeur of the culture he was writing out of. Whatever their differences, however, both men produced essentially poetic works. The rhetorical device of repeating over and over again the phrase "je me souviens" or "I remember" eventually turns the text into a sort of incantation. The reader, like the writer, might not only discover long-hidden memories, but also come to recognize and even succumb to the hypnotic strength of the act of remembering itself. By the time one has gone through a few hundred sentences, all beginning "I remember," the I might have dissolved in the remembering. Memory then becomes a potentially more selfless place, a shared city that can be seen with greater clarity than when one actually lived there. But of course, one never actually lived there. The city of memory is always somewhere else. I remember that Black Beauty was banned until the censors realized they'd made a mistake. I remember when someone's garden was dug up by the police in search for banned books. I remember a mournful Afrikaans poem about a black girl, a pool, and a crocodile. I remember that when black women took off their doeks or bonnets, their hair looked naked. I remember the girls' high school where peanuts were banned from the tuck shop because they were supposed to be sexually stimulating. I remember dirty pictures being handed around at high school. I remembering what exactly the intercourse part of sexual intercourse meant. I remember thinking that sex would be so much more clean and pure if there wasn't all that pubic hair. I remember the procession of men who jumped off the coal truck and through our back gate bearing shiny black bags of coal and orange sacks of sliced pine logs. I remember the dustbin men running after the dustbin truck, which was always just beyond their reach. I remember black men entering back gates to visit the maid, unacknowledged by anyone in the garden apart from the dog. I remember my father raging at our neighbor's young son for calling a black man boy. I remember white male drivers asking the petrol pump attendant to fill her up sharp, sharp. Okay, chief? I remember dusty diamond mesh burglar proofing and bells you could press in all the bedrooms. I remember the broken window panes of maids' rooms stuffed with yellowing newspaper. I remember whites in the kitchen asking their maids what the weather was going to be like that day. I remember dirty jokes about Mary and her little lamb and Mary and her little duck. I remember elephant jokes, including one about an elephant upside down in a bowl of custard. I remember knock-knock jokes. I remember climbing up the brick stairs to get onto the elephant's back for a ride at the zoo. I remember the elephant conductor's sharp iron prod and the way the stretch of grass and trees beyond the cages seemed to turn wild as the elephant went shambling along. I remember the yellow plastic arrow that shot out from the side of cars to indicate that you were turning right. Also, the arm motion as if you were stirring air below the driver's window to indicate that you were turning left. I remember traffic patrols of primary school pupils with serious faces wearing sashes and bearing a stop sign on a pole. I remember that when the middle-aged lady who was my driving teacher produced some plastic toy cars to show me how to park, it made me think of stories about couple therapists using plastic dolls to enlighten their patients. I remember my mother's fury when I refused to eat meat anymore. I remember headbands, sandalwood bracelets, bushy beards, musk perfume, and kundalini. I remember the incredible string band. I remember Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. I remember Baba Ram Das. I remember when the little guru came to South Africa and all his followers had the same vision of something multicolored in the sky. I remember the pretty girl who read to me from one of those slim quote books of universal wisdom that love is not looking at someone, but looking with someone in the same direction. I remember problems between a yoga teacher and one or two women who weren't as attracted to him as he had imagined. I remember Carole King singing, "Winter, spring, summer, or fall, all you've got to do is call and I'll come running." I remember when everyone was reading Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. I remember when everyone was reading Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I remember rumors about the Maharishi, the Beatles, and Mia Farrow. I remember people with illuminated faces saying "shoo" and describing the colors they saw when meditation took them up the chakras. I remember when some of my friends had been arrested and others were doing headstands with me during a yoga class. I remember music for Zen meditation. I remember pictures in the paper of Buddhist monks in Vietnam sitting with their robes on fire in public places. I remember the two noises when a needle skidded from the end of the last track across the smooth vinyl at the end of a record and then across the paper label. I remember the problem of scratched records, warped records, and records with various substances accidentally stuck to the best tracks. I remember the Beach Boys singing "Good Vibrations." I remember a friend of mine standing on a bridge over a busy road and saying he could feel black vibes. I remember someone saying that inside every silver lining there was a big black cloud. I remember my mother rushing out of the door in her white coat in the morning and my father leaving for a walk after dinner and not coming back. I remember how much time there was at night with no parents and a bored maid gazing at a wall in the kitchen. I remember when the bird in my dark chocolate cuckoo clock got stuck and let out a dry squawk. I remember lying in bed tracing a figure 8 with my big toe against the upper sheet and thinking about something I seemed to have thought about before but that dissolved as I lay there thinking about it. I remember my father calling out, "Durban time," in a low sing-song voice to wake me up in the half-light so we could all go on holiday. I remember, "What's the time? Time you got to watch. What's the time? 9:30 my freckle. And what's the time? 9:30, hang your brookies on the line." I remember learning that in the time it takes to say one hippopotamus slowly, a second has gone by. I remember watches with a thin red second hand, watches that told you on the back how many jewels there were inside, and waterproof watches that weren't. I remember watches with a little window for the day and another one for the date that was always wrong. I remember our teacher asking us how long we thought our bones would last. I remember, "The worms crawl out, the worms crawl in. They crawl in thin and they crawl out stout. Ah-woo-ah-ee, ah-woo-ah-ee, how happy we will be." I remember when we went to a fun fair and the Zulu watchman came up and told us everything was closed because Stratum had just died. I remember an Afrikaans song on the radio with an accordion and a man singing all the months of the year in a jovial voice that sounded as if he had just had a lot of beer and a braai. I remember the 4 o'clocks growing among the blackjacks near our black fence. I remember discovering what 5 o'clock shadow meant and looking at men to see if they had any on their faces. I remember the problem of finding a man who would teach me how to shave. I remember prefects on gate duty and late detention. I remember the teacher who used to tell us we would be late for our own funeral. I remember 90-day detention and 180-day detention. I remember when people were reading Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. I remember the sunrise, sunset song in Fiddler on the Roof with the line, "Is this the little girl I carried?" I remember my mother telling me how she was on her way home from medical school and I came rushing up the road to meet her. I remember listening to Bob Dylan singing "Time Passes Slowly When You're Searching for Love" and wondering why, if he was right, time seemed to be passing so quickly for me. I remember the birds singing, "To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time to every purpose under heaven." I remember Donald Campbell and his bluebird, Paul Nash with his smooth brown hair, licking everyone in the world at 100 yards until something went wrong with his bones, and Sterling Moss, who had such an unlikely surname for a racing driver. I remember when I was about to fall in love for the first time and the girl in question was wearing trousers, sitting cross-legged under a table and talking to a girlfriend at a party in someone's Johannesburg flat. I remember that when I met the woman I was going to marry, the first thing we talked about was our grandmothers. I remember the sound of our daughter's heart, audible thanks to a monitor in the delivery room before she was born. like a horse that was softly pounding with great speed towards us. It is the 3rd of October 1999, and my father dies. Memory comes storming against me. It is as if I had been cut loose from the prison where I too had been planted. Does any root of the self run more deeply than into a place where the self has been wounded? When my father went to prison, our whole family was in part arrested. Now, in love and sadness and release, I am flying in a typhoon of scraps of paper upon which I write morning, night, and afternoon. What I remember of the place I have left behind. The further it is, the closer I bring it to mind, keeping it, leaving it, not leaving it, unchanged. Memory is not exactly a translation of what happened. It is an agent of transformation. Does this mean, then, that we can actually go back and alter the way things happened? If I write a novel in which the black maid in Johannesburg in 1960 is now seen entirely in her own right, undiminished, feeling free to love a man, even in the narrow box of a room at the bottom of a madam's garden, if her place is equal to anyone else's in the book, then can the past itself be experienced differently? I know only that the question can be asked, and that memory and the imagination are of the same liquid lineage. Something loosens when they play. Guilt and gutlessness no longer call the tune, inner space widening like night under a white hot full moon. Okay, I'm going to say something. I want to read one last text. Is that okay, time-wise? Wolfgang? I'm going to read one text from this novel. But I have to say something before I start. There is a woman. Her name is Felicity Glanville, and she's a young widow. And she thinks she has just met the man of her heart. By a series of circumstances which you will only discover if you read the book, without really getting very close to this man, she comes into possession of his trousers, which she promises to have repaired by her maid, whose name is Rosie, and who lives in a small room at the bottom of her garden, and who puts off mending them under circumstances which you might discover if you wish, but who finally one evening starts to do so. You should know that at this time in history in South Africa under apartheid, the black woman who was the maid and who was known as a girl lived alone. Whether she was 18 years old or 58 years old, whether she had a family and children or not, she lived alone in the white city, and those who were close to her lived far away. So Rosie is sitting in her room mending the trousers. Rosie finished mending the trousers and left them loosely folded on her crate table as she sat under the naked light in her room, embroidering a doily with copper orange flowers. There were dogs barking as usual, but she paid no attention to them. There was an aeroplane in the sky, and then it was gone. For a time, her mind was entirely at the tip of the needle, filling the color of the petals. It was a bouquet, a cotton garden bed of flowers for her mother, who was ill and had herself gone up north to her own mother's place in Seshego Township, next to Petersburg. Then, without warning, Elias was at her door. That is the man she loves. She gave a start, but let him in without a sound. He was sweating and breathing quite hard. His eyes were restless, and he held his head to one side, listening. She asked him nothing. He was like a bicycle wheel, turning and turning tensely as he stood before her. There was little stillness in his body, and it was not possible to approach him. She went out to fetch some water in a glass jar from the garden tap. He drank from it still standing, and his eyes did not leave her. She waited. His quick eyes and fresh smile and even the acid smell of his sweat made her glad. He instantly turned her room into a place of life, and her heart was thumping. Yet she sat at the edge of her bed and waited, her want balanced in her against an undertow of reserve. Had he not hurt her in making her wait for him, and would he not hurt her again? At length he reached out, and as he switched off the raw light, the distance between them contracted, and he was everywhere in the dark. He took hold of her, and against him she felt the tightness of her body in her shoulders and up her spine, tension packed at the curve of her neck and hard as a fist at the base of her head, all the nights of his absence and all the days of subservience pressed under her skin. He must hold her more strongly and more strongly still and bring her body back with his hands. She could hardly breathe with want. It had been so long, too long without his weight against her like this. the full length of him, hip and arm, and the wetness of his chest and forehead, the restless, angular shape of him. Where had he been? She did not want to think where he had been. Afterwards, she stayed awake, not well accustomed to his sleeping presence in her bed, which was barely wide enough for two. He had fallen asleep so quickly against her. She lay watching the stillness of his slim cheek, the dip of scar tissue on his forehead above his left eye, collecting light from outside. After a while, she wanted to jab him at the waist and wake him up again. Never mind his exhaustion, she would pull him up and leave with him in the night, go with him wherever he wanted, but miles from this narrow, sterile place. How could she stay behind once more when he left and then start waiting all over again? He must marry you, Victoria had said. He must not simply take his pleasure and leave. But where could she go with him? He had no permission to be in Johannesburg, and her job for the moment was here. She had not found another place. Elias slept, and now she grew concerned that her madam might find him on her property the next morning. It was not possible to predict that woman's reactions. But eventually she closed her eyes and after a while allowed the rhythmic chug of his breathing to carry her into sleep. Next thing, Elias had pulled from her arms and was moving around at the bedside. "Police," he said. She could hear nothing. Then an Afrikaans voice, "Roer jou!" It was out in the street. It was the dog ripping the air with its barking, perhaps an Alsatian. "Wait," she said, "they do not know you are here." But he was already dressed, instructing her to put on her slip and get back into bed before he himself was outside the door, easy as a breeze. She listened intently but heard no sign that he might be accosted. Then heavy steps came towards her room and a knocking like that of owners. They stabbed their torchlight all around as the door swung open, but they did not switch on the light. She did not at first realize why, holding her arms around herself, hoping they would not notice how she was shaking as she stood by her bed. There were three of them. She could make out the shapes of their peaked hats, guns, and handcuffs, clinking at their belts as they directed their torches at her. Up and down her body, speaking to each other about her, laughing for each other, the low, leering threat of their complicity. One of them approached her. He had a thick brush of moustache and smeared the air with a stink of beer and cigarette smoke. "Maak gou," said one of the others, and reached out to poke her between the thighs with the tip of his sjambok as they went out, still cracking jokes. She tried to move away from the bed, but he pushed her back, pinning her down, pressing at her with a portly uniformed waist. She hit at his face, clawed at it, swiveled to one side, and managed to lever herself away from his weight, wanting only to get out of the room. Just for an instant she stood free, but he was at her again, grabbing at her shoulders, slamming her up against the door. He jerked at her and with one hand fended her off as he tried to loosen his fly. She grabbed at his hand and sunk her nails into it till she drew blood. He swore as he knocked her head back, twisting her arm, pulling up her slip as high as her breasts, and then finally she cried out as she kicked at him with all her strength. Felicity Glanville called out from the house in a voice drugged with sleep, "Rosie?" She did not answer. She could not find her own voice. Her tongue stuck to the dryness of her palate, but the man thrust himself at her once more before releasing her, pushing her so that she lost her balance as he made for the door. "Rosie?" came the voice again, louder this time. "It's all right, missus," she answered. The man was gone. Dogs were barking again. She lay down, holding herself by the shoulders. Later that morning, when, like Felicity Glanville, but for very different reasons, she could not properly wake up, she was almost glad the man had come at her while the others left the room, though the filth of his invasion was still in her pores. Otherwise, they might have looked further around the room and found Elias's trousers, which had slipped under the chair, and started asking questions. And then she went cold in the stomach, realizing that if Elias had left his own trousers behind, it must have been in Mr. van Arden's trousers that he had made his getaway.